Welcome to the crime reporting. Before we begin, imagine living in fear inside your own home for years. Then one night, a single gunshot changes everything. Was it an act of murder, or the desperate decision of someone who believed they wouldn't survive another attack? Today's case is one of the most controversial domestic violence cases in Louisiana history, a story that sparked years of legal battles and continues to divide opinion to this day. If you want to follow real true crime investigations based on court records, verified reporting, and documented evidence, subscribe to the crime reporting and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. If you find this video informative, please leave a like. It helps the channel reach more people. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's examine the case of Catina Curley. March 30, 2005. As darkness settled over a quiet neighborhood in New Orleans East, a 911 call sent police rushing toward a modest family home. Inside, they found a husband lying on the floor with a gunshot wound to his chest. His name was Renaldo Curley. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. His wife, Catina Curley, admitted she had fired the shot. To many, the case appeared painfully simple. A domestic argument had turned deadly. Before the night was over, Catina was under arrest, and local television stations reported that a woman had shot and killed her husband following a dispute inside their home. Investigators quickly formed a theory. Prosecutors would later argue that jealousy and anger had fueled a violent confrontation that ended in murder. But over the years, another picture emerged through police reports, witness testimony, court records, and appeals. That picture described a marriage marked by repeated allegations of domestic violence. It raised questions about fear, trauma, and whether one terrifying moment could only be understood by looking at everything that came before it. More than 20 years after the shooting, the case continues to divide opinions. Was Catina Curley a murderer? Or was she a woman who believed she would not survive another night? To understand why that single gunshot continues to spark debate, the story has to begin long before March 2005. Catina Curley spent most of her adult life in New Orleans East, an area known for its close-knit neighborhoods and working-class families. Friends described her as someone devoted to raising her children. Life was rarely easy, but like many parents, she focused on keeping her family together. Renaldo Curley also built his life in the same community. Together, the couple shared a large blended family. They had been married for nearly a decade and were raising 7 children between them, with 5 living in the household full-time. From the outside, they appeared to be an ordinary family. Family photographs showed birthdays, holidays, smiling children, and moments that looked no different from countless other households across Louisiana. But according to later court filings, appearances hid a much darker reality. Years after the shooting, attorneys presented evidence that Catina had allegedly endured more than a decade of physical abuse. Those allegations did not rely only on her own testimony. Police records documented multiple domestic violence complaints involving the couple over an 11-year period. According to those reports, officers responded to incidents involving accusations that Renaldo had struck, punched, bitten, choked, and physically assaulted Catina on numerous occasions. Some reports noted visible injuries. One documented bite marks. Others described bruises around her face and body. Court records later described incidents in which Catina allegedly suffered a dislocated shoulder after being thrown to the ground during an assault. Another incident reportedly left her with a broken nose and severe swelling that made it difficult for her to open her eyes. Witnesses also described seeing injuries. Her employer later testified that he had noticed bruising and swelling on several occasions. According to his testimony, These injuries were serious enough that he believed she had experienced significant physical trauma. The violence, according to testimony, did not happen behind closed doors alone. Several of the Curley children later described witnessing arguments that became physical. One daughter testified that she had seen her father strike her mother so many times she could no longer estimate the number. Another child simply described it as happening a lot. Court records also included allegations that some of the children themselves experienced physical abuse. Those accounts became important years later because they suggested the violence inside the home had been witnessed by multiple members of the family, rather than existing only as competing claims between husband and wife. According to Catina's testimony, asking for help was never easy. She later explained that during violent confrontations, she often feared trying to contact police because Renaldo would allegedly stop her before she could complete the call. She testified that if she reached for a telephone, he sometimes damaged it or prevented her from using it. Whether every allegation could be independently verified would later become part of the legal debate. But what was not disputed was that police had responded to domestic disturbance complaints involving the couple years before the shooting. As the marriage continued, the relationship became increasingly unstable. Arguments reportedly centered on money, trust, and repeated accusations of infidelity. Friends and relatives would later describe a household filled with tension. Still, despite everything, the marriage continued. The children continued attending school. Life continued moving forward. Then came March 30, 2005. According to testimony presented in court, the day's argument began over another woman. Catina believed another woman had recently spent time inside the family home with Renaldo. The disagreement quickly intensified. One witness later recalled hearing one of the children plead with her father, "Please don't hit Mom." Those words would later become one of the most haunting details introduced during court proceedings. According to Catina, Renaldo became physically aggressive once again. She testified that he shoved her onto the bed. At one point, she said he threw a soft drink can toward her. She later recalled him threatening her during the confrontation. Frightened, she attempted to contact family members. According to her testimony, she briefly reached her aunt before the call ended. Her aunt would later testify that Catina sounded terrified during that conversation and appeared afraid another violent assault was about to happen. Catina later explained that her plan was not to continue arguing. She wanted to leave. But there was one problem. Her car keys were located in the same room where Renaldo remained. To reach them, she believed she would have to move closer to him. According to her testimony, she feared doing that. Inside the bedroom was an old revolver that Renaldo reportedly kept beneath the mattress. She later testified that she grabbed the gun, not because she intended to shoot him, but because she believed it might stop him from attacking her long enough for her to escape. Standing inside the bedroom, she pointed the revolver toward him. She later testified that she repeatedly told him not to come any closer. According to her account, he ignored those warnings. Instead, she said he continued walking toward her. Years later, she described the fear she experienced during those final moments. She testified that she had never been comfortable handling firearms. Her hands were shaking. She believed that if Renaldo reached her, he would take the gun away and assault her once again. The distance between them continued closing. Then a single shot echoed through the house. Renaldo Curley collapsed after being struck in the chest. Emergency responders were called immediately. Despite efforts to save him, he died only minutes later. Everything that happened after that single gunshot would become the focus of years of legal battles. Police officers arriving at the scene began collecting evidence almost immediately. For investigators, the question was no longer whether Catina had fired the weapon. She admitted that she had. The question became why. Was this murder? Or was it self-defense? That answer would determine whether Catina Curley spent the rest of her life as a free woman or behind prison walls. Within hours of the shooting, investigators believed they already understood what had happened. A husband was dead. His wife had admitted pulling the trigger. To police, it appeared to be a domestic argument that had ended in murder. That same night, Catina Curley was taken into custody and transported to the police station for questioning. During the interview, she did not deny firing the revolver. Instead, she tried to explain what had led to that moment. According to the recorded statement later referenced in court proceedings, Catina repeatedly described living in fear of her husband. She told detectives that every serious argument left her believing her life was in danger. She explained that the shooting was not planned. She said she had not been waiting for an opportunity to kill Renaldo. Instead, she claimed she believed another violent assault was about to happen. According to her account, years of abuse had convinced her that if he reached her, she would once again be beaten, perhaps even killed. Investigators listened to her statement. But almost immediately, the case began moving in a different direction. Within hours, authorities announced that Catina would face a charge of second-degree murder, a charge carrying a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole under Louisiana law at the time. News reports that evening described the shooting as the result of a domestic argument. Some broadcasts even stated that the couple had no history of domestic violence. Years later, that statement would become one of the most controversial aspects of the early investigation. Court records revealed that police had previously responded to multiple domestic disturbance calls involving the Curley household over more than a decade. Those records documented allegations of repeated violence and visible injuries. Critics later questioned how investigators could publicly state there was no history of abuse when police files already contained numerous reports connected to the same couple. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they developed a clear theory of the case. According to the state, Catina was not acting in lawful self-defense. Instead, prosecutors argued that an argument over another woman escalated into anger and jealousy. They alleged that rather than walking away, Catina chose to arm herself and intentionally shoot her husband. The defense, however, viewed the case very differently. Catina insisted she had fired only because she believed she was about to suffer another brutal assault. She argued that years of violence had shaped the way she perceived danger. The central issue would become whether the jury believed that fear was reasonable. The trial began in 2007 inside an Orleans parish courtroom. Over several days, jurors heard testimony from investigators, family members, witnesses, and Catina herself. The prosecution emphasized the fatal shot. They questioned whether Renaldo had actually posed an immediate threat at the exact moment the gun was fired. They suggested that Catina had opportunities to leave the house or seek help, instead of using deadly force. Why hadn't she asked relatives to accompany her? Why hadn't she called police sooner? Why hadn't someone else retrieved her keys? To prosecutors, these unanswered questions weakened her claim of self-defense. The defense introduced evidence of years of alleged abuse. Police reports were presented. Witnesses described injuries they had seen. Family members testified about violent incidents inside the home. Several of the children described witnessing physical abuse. But according to later court rulings, one critical piece of the defense was missing. Catina's attorney, John Fuller, did not present expert testimony explaining the psychological effects that prolonged domestic abuse can have on a victim. Today, that concept is often discussed using the term battered woman syndrome, a psychological framework that may help juries understand why survivors sometimes perceive danger differently after years of repeated violence. Years later, multiple courts would closely examine whether that testimony should have been presented. At the time, however, jurors never heard expert evidence explaining how long-term abuse might affect Catina's decisions on the night of the shooting. Instead, they were left to evaluate her actions largely without that context. After deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Catina Curley was convicted of second-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Catina, the conviction meant she would likely spend the rest of her life inside the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. Her children were left to grow up without either parent. One had died inside their family home. The other would leave the courtroom in handcuffs. For many observers, the case appeared finished. Another homicide, another conviction, another life sentence. But not everyone believed justice had been done. As the years passed, attorneys reviewing the case began asking difficult questions. Had the jury truly heard all the evidence? Did Catina receive effective legal representation? Should experts have explained the psychological impact of years of alleged domestic violence? Those questions eventually reached Louisiana's courts. And what happened next would dramatically change the future of the case. Nearly a decade after the conviction, judges reviewing the trial concluded that serious mistakes may have affected the outcome. The legal battle that followed would stretch for years, reaching the Louisiana Supreme Court and reopening a case many believed had ended forever. For the Curley family, the fight over what really happened inside that New Orleans East home was far from over. In fact, it was only entering its most important chapter. For years after the verdict, Catina Curley's world barely changed. Each morning began behind the walls of the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. The life sentence imposed in 2007 meant that, under Louisiana law at the time, she had no realistic expectation of ever walking free. Her children grew older without her. Birthdays, graduations, family gatherings, and holidays passed while she remained incarcerated, convinced that the justice system had never fully heard her story. Outside prison, however, the conversation surrounding domestic violence was beginning to change. Across the United States, researchers, psychologists, and legal scholars were paying greater attention to how years of repeated abuse could affect a survivor's perception of danger. Courts increasingly recognized that victims of long-term domestic violence sometimes respond to threats differently than someone with no history of abuse. This growing understanding would eventually become central to Catina's case. After reviewing the trial record, appellate attorneys argued that her original defense had been fundamentally incomplete. They did not claim the shooting never happened. Catina had always admitted firing the fatal shot. Instead, they argued that the jury had never been given the tools to properly understand why she believed deadly force was necessary. According to the appeal, trial attorney John Fuller failed to investigate one of the most important aspects of the case: whether expert testimony explaining the psychological effects of prolonged domestic abuse should have been presented to the jury. That argument became the foundation of years of post-conviction litigation. The legal issue was no longer simply whether Catina acted in self-defense. The question became whether she had received the effective legal representation guaranteed by the Constitution. During post-conviction proceedings, evidence of the alleged abuse was examined once again. Court records referenced years of police, reports documenting domestic disturbances involving the Curley household. Witness testimony describing injuries was revisited. Statements from family members and the Curley children were again placed before the courts. Perhaps most importantly, judges examined what the jury never heard. Legal experts argued that an experienced psychologist could have explained how repeated violence may shape a victim's perception of immediate danger. Such testimony, they argued, would not tell jurors what verdict to reach. Instead, it would provide scientific context for evaluating Catina's actions on the night of the shooting. Years after her conviction, a Louisiana trial court agreed that serious mistakes had occurred during the original defense. The court concluded that John Fuller had failed to provide effective legal representation by not properly investigating or presenting evidence related to battered woman syndrome. It was a significant ruling. For the first time since entering prison, Catina's conviction appeared vulnerable. But the legal battle was far from over. Prosecutors appealed the decision. The case moved to Louisiana's appellate courts, where judges reached a different conclusion. The appellate court focused on a separate legal issue involving insanity and ultimately ruled that there was insufficient evidence to justify overturning the conviction on that basis. As a result, the trial court's decision granting Catina relief was reversed. Once again, it appeared that the life sentence would remain in place. For many defendants, that might have marked the end of the road. But Catina's attorneys continued the fight. The case eventually reached the Louisiana Supreme Court. The state's highest court carefully reviewed the trial record, the evidence presented during post-conviction proceedings, and the performance of the original defense attorney. In a decision that attracted national attention among criminal justice advocates, the Louisiana Supreme Court reached a different conclusion. The justices determined that the original defense had failed to adequately investigate one of the central issues in the case. According to the court, the jury should have been given the opportunity to hear expert testimony concerning the psychological effects of prolonged domestic abuse and how that evidence related to Catina's claim of self-defense. The Supreme Court concluded that her attorney had failed to properly prepare and present that defense. As a result, the court ordered that Catina receive a new trial. It was an extraordinary development. More than a decade after being sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison, her conviction was no longer the final word. The decision did not declare Catina innocent, nor did it determine that she had acted in lawful self-defense. Instead, the court ruled that she deserved a new trial, where a jury could hear evidence that had been missing the first time. Shortly afterward, another major decision followed. After spending more than 10 years behind bars, Catina was granted release on a $1,000 bond while awaiting retrial. For the first time in over a decade, she walked out of prison. Photographs from that period showed emotional reunions with family members who had waited years for the opportunity to embrace her outside prison walls. For her supporters, the moment represented hope. For prosecutors, it raised serious concerns. Then Orleans Parish District Attorney Leon Canizaro publicly criticized the decision. He described the bond as disturbing and unprecedented, arguing that Catina still represented a danger to the community despite the Supreme Court's ruling. His office remained committed to prosecuting the case once again. Supporters of Catina viewed the situation very differently. They argued that the legal system had failed to fully consider years of alleged domestic violence during the original trial. Advocates for survivors of abuse pointed to her case as an example of how trauma can be misunderstood inside courtrooms. As news of the Supreme Court's decision spread, Catina's story reached audiences far beyond Louisiana. Organizations focused on domestic violence reform began discussing the case alongside other nationally known prosecutions involving women who claimed they acted out of fear after enduring prolonged abuse. The case became part of a broader national conversation. How should courts evaluate self-defense when years of violence precede a single fatal encounter? Can fear created by repeated abuse influence what a person reasonably believes is an immediate threat? And how should juries weigh that evidence? Those questions remain some of the most difficult issues in criminal law. For Catina Curley, they would once again become the focus of a courtroom. The next trial would not simply revisit one gunshot fired in March 2005. It would ask whether justice had truly been served the first time. And for both the prosecution and the defense, the stakes could not have been higher. As Catina Curley's case returned to the public spotlight, it became about far more than one family's tragedy. It evolved into a discussion about domestic violence, self-defense, and the responsibility of the legal system when evaluating survivors who claim they acted out of fear. Despite the Louisiana Supreme Court's decision ordering a new trial, one fact never changed. Renaldo Curley had lost his life. Nothing the courts decided could undo that loss, and nothing could erase the pain experienced by his family, friends, or the children who lost their father. At the same time, Catina's supporters argued that another reality could not be ignored. According to years of court records, police reports, and witness testimony, she had consistently alleged that she endured repeated physical abuse throughout the marriage. Those allegations formed the foundation of her claim that she believed she was facing another violent attack on the night of the shooting. The prosecution and the defense continued to see the same evidence through completely different lenses. Prosecutors maintained that the shooting was not legally justified and that Catina intentionally killed her husband during an argument. The defense argued that the events of March 30, 2005, could not be separated from the years that came before them. They maintained that understanding the history of the relationship was essential to determining whether Catina's fear was reasonable under the circumstances. That disagreement lies at the heart of the case. Unlike many homicide investigations that depend primarily on forensic evidence, this case largely turned on a person's state of mind. What did Catina honestly believe in the seconds before she pulled the trigger? Did she reasonably think she faced an immediate threat of death or serious bodily harm? Or did she use deadly force when the law did not allow it? Those are questions that no photograph, fingerprint, or laboratory test can answer by themselves. Instead, juries must weigh testimony, credibility, prior history, and the surrounding circumstances before reaching a conclusion. The Louisiana Supreme Court's ruling did not determine which side was correct. Rather, it recognized that the original jury had not heard evidence that could have helped answer those difficult questions. That distinction is important. Ordering a new trial is not the same as declaring someone innocent. Likewise, overturning a conviction does not automatically mean the prosecution's case was weak. Instead, it reflects the court's conclusion that the original proceedings may not have been legally fair. In Catina's case, the issue centered on whether her attorney had adequately investigated and presented expert testimony regarding the psychological effects of prolonged domestic abuse. The Supreme Court concluded that he had not. That ruling has since been discussed in legal circles as an example of how defense attorneys are expected to thoroughly investigate every significant issue that could affect a jury's understanding of a case. The decision also highlighted the growing recognition of expert testimony involving survivors of domestic violence. Such testimony does not excuse criminal conduct or guarantee an acquittal. Instead, it provides jurors with specialized knowledge that may help them understand behaviors that otherwise appear confusing or inconsistent. For example, survivors sometimes remain in abusive relationships for years. Some delay reporting abuse. Others attempt to leave multiple times before finally escaping. Without expert context, jurors may incorrectly assume those actions are inconsistent with genuine fear. Modern psychological research suggests the reality is often far more complicated. At the same time, courts must also carefully evaluate claims of self-defense to ensure they are supported by the evidence. Every case depends on its own unique facts. That is why judges repeatedly emphasize that no single diagnosis or history of abuse automatically determines whether a homicide is legally justified. Each jury must independently evaluate all of the evidence presented during trial. Catina's case also became part of a broader national discussion surrounding women convicted after killing abusive partners. Advocates argued that some survivors receive lengthy prison sentences because juries never fully understand the effects of prolonged violence. Others cautioned that every homicide deserves careful scrutiny and that claims of abuse must always be tested through the judicial process. Those competing perspectives continue to shape legal debates across the United States. Years after the shooting, the Curley case remains one of Louisiana's most closely watched domestic violence prosecutions. It is a reminder that criminal cases are rarely as simple as the first headlines suggest. The initial news reports described a woman who shot her husband during an argument. The years that followed revealed a much larger and more complicated story involving allegations of repeated abuse, questions about effective legal representation, conflicting interpretations of self-defense law, and the difficult task juries face when weighing fear against criminal responsibility. Whatever conclusion people ultimately reach, the case demonstrates why courts rely on evidence rather than assumptions. It also shows how appellate courts can reshape a case years after a verdict when they determine that critical legal issues were overlooked during the original trial. For Catina Curley, the fight became about receiving a trial in which every relevant piece of evidence could be fairly considered. For Renaldo Curley's family, it remained a case about a life that ended with a single gunshot inside the family home. Both realities exist within the same story. As of the latest public court proceedings, Catina continues to maintain that she acted in self-defense after years of abuse. The prosecution has continued to challenge that claim through the legal process. The ultimate resolution depends on the courts and the evidence presented before them. Cases like this remind us that justice is often far more complex than a single verdict. Behind every courtroom decision are real people, broken families, and events that cannot be undone. If this case receives significant new developments, new rulings, or a final resolution, those updates will provide the next chapter in a story that has already spanned decades. Until then, the death of Renaldo Curley and the legal battle surrounding Catina Curley's actions remains one of the most debated domestic violence cases to emerge from New Orleans, continuing to raise difficult questions about fear, survival, accountability, and the pursuit of justice. That concludes the case of Catina Curley, a story that continues to raise difficult questions about domestic violence, self-defense, and the pursuit of justice. As with many true crime cases, the legal process reveals just one part of a much larger human story. Thank you for watching the crime reporting. If you found this case informative, please leave a like and subscribe for more real true crime investigations based on court records and verified reporting. We'd also like to hear your thoughts. Based on the evidence presented, what do you think happened? Share your opinion respectfully in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and thank you for watching the crime reporting.